Hello everybody, and welcome to Witte de With for today's symposium. Every contact leaves a trace, follow the... and so today's symposium, it departs from our current exhibition in the Belly of the Whale, which is on display on the second floor. So after the conference, if you have a chance to see it, do, because it provides some context to what we are doing today. But in brief, it's a group exhibition that departs from the story of Jonah and the whale, which we probably all know the story of. And we were interested, myself and Adam Kleinman, who's the other curator of the show, to examine how art objects or images can trace various social or political realities, various contexts through measuring reception or reading. But also that objects and images are not in themselves inert, but that they produce their own realities and affects as well, and supporting various discourses. So this sort of dialectical approach is borne out through the artworks and some scientific objects as well in the show upstairs. And I'll hand over to Adam to discuss a little more about today's proceedings and to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Ooh, my voice. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Yeah, just wanted to do a little housekeeping. I'll be brief because we have a long day ahead of us. So everyone should have picked up one of these, I guess, on their seats. And it's just our little program guide. It has bios of everyone who we'll get to know more throughout the day, but I'll skip the biographical information in interest of time. But please do read it over. And then we'll have a little break in the middle. We'll do 3 presentations, including some screenings, then 3 more, well, 2 more, and then a plenary. So totally symmetrical. And please hold off any questions or whatever till that point, and we'll have a discussion, which I think is particularly pertinent. I just flew in from New York. I'm a New Yorker. And our friends over in England, where we got our language from, just in the OED made post-truth the word of the year. And for those of you who know what it means, I don't really know what it means. But basically, supposedly coming out of this year, 2016, the year of fun, because of things such as our new president-elect, our United States, Donald Trump, and particularly his media campaign, which was, of course, similarly paralleling things such as Brexit and the Leave camps rhetoric, which was filled with not only gross inaccuracies, but gross misrepresentations. And now that we all have to deal with this somehow, one of the big debates that's going on in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere, most probably in this country, and maybe that's something to talk about, is what is reception now, what is broadcast, what is discussion, when facts don't seem to really work anymore, when images have lives of their own that are radically manipulated, where the intention of the image might be totally different from its reception, and how those things move around in the world. And we were kind of feeling that fermenting a bit, so the exhibition, part of the reason why we took the Jonah idea was, of course, you know, the biblical story, and now I'm upset to have a Christian reference, considering what's going on in the world, but of course, the prophet was inside the belly of the whale, and in there, cut off from context, he had to ruminate. And then ultimately, theoretically, he was shirking his responsibilities, and he goes out and does them. So in that kind of spirit, we were thinking that actually the exhibition itself is a bit investigative. It's not any sort of thesis kind of thing, because as the world has been telling us, certain forms of intentionality and interests don't often go how you expect. So similarly, today is in that spirit. It's kind of a series of a mix of keynotes and films by various artists and so on and so forth that we can consider not exactly like case studies, but little sort of road posts in which we can sort of rethink, you know, what it means to have something out in the world and what its use is. And particularly one of the things that we're kind of concerned with in the exhibition above was the classic idea of autonomy, right? The classic Enlightenment idea that something is cut off from itself and manifests as it's supposed to everywhere, independently, universally, so on and so forth. And Natasha and I, thought that's not really true. There's many works upstairs, which I do invite you to go look at, that actually question that. The most illustrative one is a work by Katie Kollwitz, who is a German artist, I believe the first woman professor in German history, who made a protest image of starving children to critique food scarcity shortages after World War I. What happened, I can't remember the exact year of the work, it's the Weimars, it's the 20s, right? 20s. Of course, you know, things changed in Germany in the 30s, which some people are looking at today. And in the lead up to the Nazi regime, of course, they created one of the most complex and, contemporary propaganda, filmic, some would say. And what they did is they actually appropriated Katie Kollwitz's image and took the exact same image, which was a protest against hunger shortages. And interestingly, I mean, this is a much bigger debate because I'm not even going to get into that. But they appropriated the image and re-tagged it and used it for their own Nazi propaganda, saying, actually, if you let the communists into the chancellery, and if the communists take over as opposed to the National Socialists, this is what will happen. You'll have starving children and so on and so forth. So you have the exact same image, nothing changed about it, right? And two very different uses, and this is something to think about now. I don't know if people are in the mood for protesting and things like that, but it's a weird signpost to look at in relationship to this. Also, once the Nazis did come to power, Katie Kollwitz, of course, gets sacked from her job and goes into hiding, and that's a whole other story. So also, not only do things have histories and uses and affects and so on and so forth, and not only affects, actually instrumental uses in the world that are maybe very different from the original intention. There's also emanations of other histories that come out of it, and all of these things can be read. And that's kind of why the title is called Every Contract Leaves a Trace. Every contact leaves a trace. And every contract does leave a trace. Hopefully, that's the point of them, right? It comes from Locard, who was the first forensic scientist in France, who created the modern idea of forensic science. So that's kind of floating around in there. But like I said, today this is just meant to be speculative and investigatory, and hopefully in the end we can bring it all together through the plenary and through some discussions. I've actually been going really long, so I'm just going to hand it over to Teixeira Pinto, who will kick us off really well, I think. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Yeah? Thank you. I was planning when Adam first invited me here to talk about conspiracy theory and cognitive mapping, which is this dialectical pair that Frederick Jameson formulated, or that Frederick Jameson conceptualized in '88, more or less, I would say. But I think that now, with the unfolding events of last week, maybe, or at least like I thought that maybe I do an intro that diverges a little bit from this lineage and goes more into this triangulation of ideology, economy, and conspiracy that I think is just like such a pressing or urgent question nowadays. And just to refer back to the topic of the exhibition, I was always wondering, like, how much we believe in objects as like a locus of resistance, and I think that's quite like a belief that we cling to in the art world. And I think that what we see now, and what we see also in the examples that Adam put forth, like this images that can be used in a, like completely with a complete inversion of their meaning, is that actually maybe what we believe is the resistance, or the object's resistance, is actually, like as Tony Bennett put it, like the resistance of a narrative against another. So basically it's like narratives that are actually struggling with each other. And I think that we are really like at a crucial moment when, there is definitely one narrative that is taking root or taking hold of all the political spectrum. And it's probably time to fight back, but we don't actually know how or whom or with what. And so basically, to start structuring this a bit so that I don't get too all over the place. Ideology is like a modern concept, but of course, like, yeah, even though, of course, with time, the question of ideology, especially with mass communication media, is something that it's also like goes way back in history. So you can also like trace it to this classical moment. And the classical forms of ideology, one could say, are also like coming together with classical challenges, no? Like, so maybe the first formulation of ideology is this belief that might is right. So basically, whatever is that can impose its power is what has the right to be. And the first challenge to this formulation, or to this original formulation of ideology, would be the challenge of Antigona, no? When she challenges King Creon and buries her brother against the law, so basically disobeying the law. And she points there to this like dissociation of the law, like, no, there's the law of God and the law of man, and I would rather obey the law of God because I think that there is like some sort of like higher value or higher moral value in this law of God. And so this would be like the first moment when we have a challenge that is addressing ideology, that is saying, no, actually, I challenge your belief that might is right. Then, of course, we have the other classical challenge in Plato and Socrates, no? Like, and there, like, the question of ideology could be perhaps formulated as what is must be. So basically, the way things are is the way things must be. And then the challenge is to say that, no, like, actually, things are not what they appear. And, you know, like, we can actually create an hierarchy in between appearance and structure. Okay, structure is maybe like a very contemporary word. But I'm a little bit abusing classical philosophy here. In contemporaneity, or in the contemporary moment, ideology are the two basic, or the most whose scope is how to say, the widest in scope formulations of ideology are the one that is the most used in cultural studies. So basically, the idea that ideology is the confusion between what nature is and what culture does. So that you assume that something is natural when actually this something is cultural. For instance, the notion of gender is like a very common example for this discussion. And of course, the classical definition that Althusser put forth, that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. This is a quote. And I think that is important to recuperate this term and its meaning, because, of course, like, the question of ideology, though it had been completely dismissed in the last 30 years or so, now, you know, like, came back with immense force. And everybody's arguing whether fake news on Facebook or the spread of false information or misinformation it had an impact in the election. Everybody's arguing whether racism was the reason, or whether economical grievances were the reason for electing Trump. And I think that what interests me about it is that, of course, this question is very tied to the mise of Marxism and Marxist hermeneutics, because, of course, like, the moment the USSR collapsed was also the moment when Marxism was dismissed as a discourse. And, of course, like, the notion of ideology is central in Marxism, not because of ideology per se, but because of this, like, because the whole theory hinges on this idea that, of course, there is like you know, like that the way you perceive your existence is not, you know, it's distorted by this kind of like, or it has a, it's. Sorry, I'm a bit sick and I'm. the way you perceive your resistance is filtered by this imaginary distortions, no, like, so that it's never, you never have like an objective or accurate or factual perception of what are the structures that are actually in charge or are actually imposing themselves. And I think that now we are really, and it's also like something that we've been discussing widely, is the return of this moment when, you know, like prior to World War II or in between World War II and World War II, or World War... That's actually... Indeed. It's a slip of the tongue, but actually I think we are somewhere between World War II and World War III. And that question was a question that was posed most famously by Wilhelm Reich, basically in the wake of the Reichstagsbrandverordnung, so the Reichstag fire decree, that was edited in February 28th of 1933. And the Reichstag fire decree suspended all the civil rights protections that were afforded by the Weimar Republic. And the question Wilhelm Reich asked was, how could the masses vote for their own oppression? So basically, how could the people of Germany vote to be repressed? And this, of course, occurred in the wake of Hitler being appointed Chancellor. He was appointed Chancellor in January 30 of 33. And Reich was trying to grapple with the fact that the German people had apparently chosen the authoritarian politics promoted by National Socialism against their own political interests. And ever since this question, like the question of like how could you vote against your own interests, or how could you vote for your own oppression, has been a central question in political philosophy. Of course, with Trump winning in the election after openly campaigning for less democracy, and with the continued electoral success of the far right across Europe, this question is again an urgent question. Now, writing in 36, Walter Benjamin also saw fascism as a mock revolution. He defined it as a mobilization of revolutionary demands towards an epic feat of showmanship, which stages the power of the masses without granting the masses rights. Fascism, he noted, gives expression to the people, or to the people's will to power, while preserving capitalist class structures and keeping property relations intact. The outcome of this revolutionary carnival is the spectacularization of politics, mass rallies, histrionics, paranoid discourse, and the need to turn the lack of material resources into a drama of presence and absence charged with sexual intensity. Now, as I said before, ever since Trump won, we have been debating and fighting over whether those who voted for him were economically disenfranchised or motivated by racist or xenophobic sentiments. And Marxist theory traditionally tends to depict fascism as a form of mistaken choice, which results from false consciousness. So basically you would say that the people are gullible and thus easily led into contradictions. But Reich, for instance, refused to absolve the people who cheered for Hitler, and he argued instead that Marxism was unable to understand the power of an ideological movement like Nazism because it lacked an adequate conception of ideology's material force as an emotional or affective structure. So basically what he's saying is that the masses did not mistakenly choose fascism. Rather, there is a more fundamental non-identity between class consciousness and mass movements. So, in other words, mass movements do not arise from class consciousness because the basic features over which people identify are not necessarily like class. Now, the idea of the forgotten working men and women, which we have been all, again, debating and fighting over, could we, I wanted to show you, this is painted by John McNaughton that was bought by Sean Hannity and gifted to President-elect Trump. The painting is going to be brought to the White House. And I don't know how to interpret it completely because I must admit some of the figures are hard to recognize, but you can see that, of course, President Obama is trampling on the Constitution. Behind him is Madison that looks shocked, like completely bereft of the fact that he's like stepping on the Constitution. The despondent man sitting on the bench is the forgotten man, so basically the forgotten worker or forgotten working class white male citizen, obviously. And is surrounded by Lincoln, Reagan, George Washington, and maybe Adam knows who the other one is because I actually don't recognize. So Lincoln, Reagan, George Washington. And there's another one. That's probably Franklin? No? No? No, Madison is the one that is... Anyway, on the side of the evil ones that are clapping President Obama, who's completely oblivious to the sufferance of the forgotten man, you see Clinton, but you also see the two Roosevelts, so Teddy and FDR, and George Bush was also placed on the side of the evil ones. And strangely enough, you see in the middle, and it's a bit like, I think it's on the side of this position, you see Kennedy, and it's not clear whether he's with Obama or with Reagan. He's definitely staring at, he looks towards Obama, so maybe he's in the side of evil. But again, he was murdered himself, and he's an American martyr, so maybe, the painter didn't want it to be too blunt about it. As I was saying, this idea of the forgotten working man and woman has this twofold origin, because it was a figure of a trope that was for the first time popularized in 1932 in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And it was precisely Roosevelt, FDR, that called upon the country to tend to the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. These were his words. At the same time, FDR was pushing for an economic stimulus in order to halt both the fascist tide and the pull towards communism. But this expression resurfaced again, so it had a second birth. And this second birth is tied to President Nixon. President Nixon is, interestingly enough, absent. No, he's not absent. He's there. He's on the side of the evil ones. The second birth of the expression is tied to President Nixon, who spoke of the silent majority in the aftermath of the race riots of '68. But he did not refer to the forgotten working classes. He referred to the white percentage of the population who resented the end of formal racism, so the end of the Jim Crow, and who equated the anti-war movement with treason. Now, obviously, Trump retained both of these origins of the expression of the forgotten man, and what you hear when he mentions it or when he speaks about it is, of course, like a function of where you stand. So it's not so much something that has to do with the expression, it has to do with the audience. As we said before, capitalism is, of course, a multidimensional force whose properties can only be experienced partially. So we tend to see, or all we tend to see are its epiphenomena. We tend to see rising house prices, racism, inequality, cheap appliances, sushi in every street corner, but its full scope remains hard to grasp. And as Susan Buck-Morse points out, the imaginary of the nation-state is a purely political imaginary, so the economy plays no role in it. But precisely because economic actors are not recognized as political agents, capitalism is incapable of providing a code that will apply to the whole of the social field, as Deleuze and Guattari already had mentioned in Mille Plateaux. Instead, what it does is to set in motion a deterritorializing machine which is plagued by contradictions. Theoretically, at least, the free movement of capital should lead to a corresponding free movement of workers, in which case capitalism, which would be then unable to sustain its mode of production, would dissolve into a different socio-historical figure. And it is because of this, or it is from this perspective, that capitalism requires or necessitates fascism to violently and artificially re-territorialize social and sexual mores. You see, immigrants, for instance, they would be the ideal capitalist subjects because most migrants on temporary work arrangements are not entitled to vote, they are not entitled to any forms of benefits, but even when working illegally, they are still taxable because everything they consume pays VAT. And on the other hand, the abolition of immigration restrictions would eventually even out wages across the globe, and the labor supply would dry up in the places that exploit it the most. So this question, or like this, let's say this conundrum, is what explains the surge in nationalist rhetoric and the need to fix and moor labor by reinstituting national boundaries. As long as capitalism remains able to recruit fascist rhetoric to wage war on the underclasses, the two figures can happily coexist. But the balance is precarious, which is why liberal democracies tend to cultivate fascist fantasies whilst marginalizing fascist parties. To put it in very blunt terms, the current consensus believes that the masses must be heard when the masses voice racist sentiments, that is, when the masses reject cultural globalization, but it believes that same masses must be crushed or ignored when they voice anti-austerity sentiments or when they reject market dogma. This is why, for instance, the Syriza, the Arab Spring, Podemos, Occupy were all marginalized or crushed as movements, whilst nativism, nationalism, and xenophobia are normalized. And Adam was mentioning this just now while we were having a coffee, that the speed at which this normalization is occurring now is frightening. Like the speed at which the normalization of Trump is occurring in the media is actually staggering. An article in The Guardian I recently read even equated anti-gentrification protests with xenophobia because the demonstrators were rallying against foreign oligarchs buying scores of properties in London. So basically, like, the confusion goes up to the point where we are completely like entangling this sentiments of like hostility towards foreigners with hostility towards foreign money or foreign capital. And the rejection of globalist neoliberalism is possible culturally, but not or never economically. If one wants to see what the future will bring, one just has to look at UK, whose foreign secretary is articulating the demands of the new global order. We want free markets without freedom of movement. At least this is precisely the deal that Boris Johnson was now proposing the EU. And it's more or less the same platform Trump was campaigning on, this idea that, like we will keep, or basically we will keep globalization in its economic form, but we will not keep globalization in its cultural form. And of course, like the coming international agreements like the TTPI will reduce custom duties and other commercial barriers, but they will not introduce any measures to combat fiscal or climate dumping in those same treaties. And all of this, like CETA or the new trade deal that is now being renegotiated with the Pacific regions, remain strictly commercial treaties, meaning they are not in any case formulated in terms of political economy. So basically, again, they are tied to this imaginary of the nation state as a purely political territory. And of course, like economically speaking, this new order has been 30 years in the making. I don't know, how are we time-wise? 7 more minutes. So I'm just going to jump over this. I'm going to summarize it very, 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 very briefly. I think more or less everybody is aware of this, that what happened in the last 30 years was that we replaced policies that were trying to have or trying to achieve full employment or universal employment with policies that are vying to keep a certain percentage of unemployment at all times. This is called the NAIRU. The NAIRU is an acronym, is a concept that was introduced by Milton Friedman, and it means exactly the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Because you need to have a certain level of unemployment in order to prevent inflation. So basically, if you want to avoid having an inflationary economy, you have to keep a certain percentage of the population unemployed. This happens because the moment the population is fully employed, there is no coercion that can be used to keep laborers in their jobs. So basically, laborers are free to roam around, like to browse the job market, to find better wages. So the effect of this is that wages keep being pushed up. And of course, if wages are pushed up, the only means for capital owners to still harvest, to still retain a share of profits is to also push the prices up. So, what you have is this effect where wages and prices basically push each other up. And in order to combat this, like the proposal of the Austrian School of Economics and the Chicago School of Economics was to invert this mechanism and to basically create an economy that benefits creditors instead of debtors. And after 30 years of these policies, also, and one should not forget, after the bargaining power of the working classes was completely crushed by globalization, by the outsourcing of production, wage earners are now obviously too much in debt in an environment where wages cannot rise. Actually, they are deflated, that they keep shrinking. And the value of the debt itself keeps rising. So basically, it's an impossible situation, and economically or even mathematically speaking, is unsustainable. Because the debtors cannot pay, be it individuals or nations, and therefore they will not pay. But because the financial sector demands repayment of these debts, the nation states have been reconverted into debt collection agencies. So basically, the nation states are now acting on behalf of the financial sector, and they are trying to extract rent or debt repayment from their population. Of course, all of the political spectrum from the center left to the center right. So basically all the parties that have been in and out of government in the last 30 years are completely implicated in this policy. And this is what makes the situation so volatile and so potentially ripe for this, like either far right or far left to take over. And actually I don't remember who was arguing that recently. I don't know if it was Alain Badiou or someone else that was saying that this is also the return of antagonism in politics. And basically it means that the idea of consensus that has been winning elections since the last 30 years can no longer win elections. Know that now elections are now going to be fought and won in antagonistic terms. And again, we come to the question of ideology and identification. It's like, are we gonna win and lose these elections by identifying via identity policies or via race or via nativism? Or are we gonna fight these elections and are we gonna fight these political struggles by identifying via economical class or economical structures? To resume briefly, and to, am I like already completely 2 minutes? Okay, so I just wanted to mention the question of conspiracy in relation to the question of ideology. Susan Buck-Morss, to return to Susan Buck-Morss, argued that the defining move for the 20th century global order was the geopolitization of communism. By forging an identity between communism and the Soviet Union, the Western Bloc could equate internal dissents with treason, casting unionized labor as unpatriotic, and viewing opposition to capital as aggression by a foreign nation. This, of course, normalized the enemy, which would otherwise represent an absolute threat, because it challenged both space as a determinant of sovereignty, and the separation between political and economic discourses, upon which capitalism is predicated. So basically in the US, for most of the recent history, to be a leftist was to be an American, in the sense of both an alien presence and a moral threat. This is I'm quoting Susan Buck-Morss, sorry. And this also tied dissent to paranoia and conspiracy, producing a discourse about internal enemies. Most importantly, in order to displace the notion of class identification and solidarity, it tied collective identity to national homogeneity. And needless to say, racism is always the shadow cast by this, by the way national homogeneity is thought of. The geopolitization of the protests that became known as the Arab Spring are also mirroring this strategy. They are confining dissent to a specific geolocation and obscuring the continuity between these uprisings and other protest movements such as the Indignados or the Occupy. And once again, these social struggles are displaced onto the site of a phantasmic antagonism between the free world and Islamic fundamentalism, as it's usually narrated. To return to paranoia, Richard Hofstetter argued, and this is a piece that was first published in the Harper's Bazaar magazine, called "The Paranoid Style in American Politics," that the idea of the paranoid style, and I quote him, as a force in politics would have little contemporary relevance or historical value if it were applied only to men with profoundly disturbed minds. It is the use of paranoid modes of expression by more or less normal people that makes the phenomenon significant. Now, Emily Apter, literary theorist, called this style one-worldlessness, adding one, which stands for one world, so basically this idea of planetary integration that became so popular after exhibitions such as The Family of Man, but also like after the publication of, help me, Stuart Brand, the magazine? What? Exactly, thank you. Sometimes the most obvious things escape us. So she added this suffix one to Hannah Arendt's concept of worldlessness, which for Arendt means or defines the condition of those who do not matter as individuals. So it expresses their lack of a social and political world. Typically, this condition, at least in Arendt's discourse, afflicts people who are stateless or otherwise deprived of political rights. But it can also be extrapolated to all those who are deprived of a way to make their actions significant and their opinions effective. So basically, in short, anyone who has been alienated from the public realm. And as Hofstadter notes, to return to Hofstadter briefly, the situation becomes worse when the representatives of a particular social position are shut out of the political process. Having no access to political bargaining or the making of decisions, they find their original conception that the world of power is sinister and malicious fully confirmed. They only see the consequences of power, and this through distorting lenses, and have no chance to observe its actual machinery. Hence, this world becomes an extension of paranoid subjectivity, and conspiracy theory becomes its mode of representation. So I end here. Sorry. I think I miscalculated.
Thank you, Anna.
Also we didn't, can we show very briefly this small little clip?
Yeah.
The military had learned in Vietnam that Tet of 68, for example, was a tactical victory of enormous proportions for it. We won. We virtually exterminated the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. In fact, when I got to Vietnam, I was fighting khaki-clad Red Star-wearing North Vietnamese regulars. I wasn't fighting Viet Cong, NLF guerrillas. But that was portrayed by the American press as a strategic defeat for the United States because we had been lying, we the military had been lying about the NLF, about the Viet Cong, about the guerrillas. We said we defeated them, there weren't very many left and so forth, and then all of a sudden they mount this massive offensive all across the peninsula. So even though we won, we lost. We lost strategically, and we lost because of the press. And so the military took that in as a huge lesson learned. And the military said, never again. So what Powell is saying is simply the power of the camera is extremely distorting. It can change a victory into a defeat or defeat into victory. So be very careful about how you handle that camera afterwards. Make sure that camera is seeing what you want it to see. Make sure that camera knows that you won. Make sure that camera knows that you won everything. You didn't lose anything at all. And stay on that camera the whole time you're there. Embed them with your troops, for example. I'll never forget an expression from a CNN reporter. I was watching it on television. I couldn't believe he said it. He said, you know, I've been with these troops here. I've been with these troops for months now, and I've eaten with them, and I've slept with them, and I've fought with them, and I've seen what they've gone through and everything, but I'm not prejudiced. It was incredible. I mean, you know, here he was with the troops. He was loving them and living with them and everything else, but he wasn't prejudiced. That's what we wanted to do, and that's what we did. Capture the camera.
Sorry. This clip that I just showed is an excerpt of a film called Hegemon by artist and filmmaker Danny Gall, and it wasn't premiered yet, so we are showing it with this permission, but we can only show a short clip. and possibly you will be able to see it when it premieres in an exhibition in its full scope. I just wanted to note very briefly that later on, our protagonist is going to note that what actually had an adverse impact in their amazing, brilliant strategy of embedding journalists was the advent of Al Jazeera. So basically, Al Jazeera was what foiled their plans. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.